Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. And we are at the brink of World War III. We are our guest, Medea Benjamin, twice nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize and co-founder of Code Pink, an international NGO that works to end US-funded wars and occupations. Medea Benjamin, a warm welcome to the program.
Nice to be with you, Jorge.
Medea, President Trump said that he was killing that general from Iran because he was representing an imminent threat to the life of the Americans, but the Pentagon says that was not the case, that he could be future problems for the US. Your reaction to the assassination?
Well, first of all, I don't believe anything that this president says. We know he's a big liar. He's been lying ever since he started campaigning for office, or way before that. Also, we know from the reality that the day after the killing of Soleimani, we are less safe than we were the day before. We see that the whole United States, the whole Middle East is living in a state of fear. There's lockdown in all the bases that the U.S. has and in the embassies. They're telling Americans not to travel to the region, and if you're in the region, get out of there. So obviously, Americans are less safe today.
In recent days, we have seen demonstrations in over 80 cities in the U.S. against the war, against the attack. And we were having the chance to talk to one of the demonstrators, said, we are not only against the war, we want to start a new movement against this war. What's going on in terms of the public opinion of the average American, what we do not see in the mass media?
The public opinion shows that the American people are tired of almost 20 years of constant war. That's one of the reasons why Trump, when he was campaigning for office, said he was going to end these endless wars. Of course, he changed that when he got into office, but Americans don't want another war. Now, public opinion can change quickly, depending on how the media portrays things. So we can't rely on the public opinion. We have to mobilize. And that's why we're mobilizing now for an International Day of Actions on January 25th to get lots more people out in the streets, not only in the United States, but around the world, to show that the world says no to Donald Trump's war on Iran.
You were talking to that British newspaper, The Guardian, and you were saying exactly what you mentioned, that Donald Trump, that as your words, said that he was going to end the wars, and then you said, here it is, here we are, say, plunging us in the abyss of war with Iran, and say that it's totally illegal what he's doing.
Well, it is totally illegal. You're not allowed to take military action against another country without going to Congress. That's in the Constitution. There was no congressional authorization for the murder of Soleimani, and now Congress is saying you must come to us. And so we were working in Congress right now to try to pass resolutions that would force Donald Trump to have an open debate in the Congress and let the Congress vote on this. But Donald Trump doesn't really care what Congress says.
Also, you were mentioning the reality is the US troops have been in Iraq doing illegal work against US law and the Iraqi constitution that we helped write. You said the killing of the most powerful military political person in Iran is such an obvious move to war that you would have to be even a bigger idiot than Donald Trump not to recognize that this is a war.
So first, let me explain a little bit of the background with Iraq, is that Iraq did force the U.S. to leave before, and that was in 2011. But then with the creation of the Islamic State that came about because of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Iraq re-invited the United States to come in 2014. But that was just to help Iraq in the fight against the Islamic State. Now that the Islamic State has been tremendously reduced, there is no reason to keep the U.S. troops. But Donald Trump himself has said to the U.S. troops that now part of their mission is to be watching Iran. And the Iraqi government says, no, we never gave you permission for that. That is illegal according to our constitution. You can't be carrying out aggressions against Iran from our state.
And they say, we want you to be out. We want to expel you. And the US say, you know what? We were invited by you, but now we're not leaving, even though you're telling us to leave. It's crazy?
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, here the U.S. is saying that it's trying to build a democracy in Iraq, and when the democratically elected government of Iraq says, we want you to leave, the U.S. says no. Not only that, but Donald Trump is saying, we're going to impose sanctions on you if you force us to leave. So it's just the height of arrogance and imperial hubris that we're seeing right now with the way Donald Trump is reacting not only towards Iran, but towards Iraq.
Why do you believe that this is taking place now? If he's saying that it's an imminent threat and he doesn't bring the proofs, but the Pentagon will say it's not such thing as an imminent threat, it will be a future threat. And we have the impeachment going on and we have a re-election in November. Could those elements could play any role here?
Well, absolutely. It seems very ironic that in the same week that they are starting these impeachment discussions in the Senate is when Donald Trump has now taken the emphasis off of that and put it on Iran. It's also a time of elections, and oftentimes you do get this kind of rah-rah rally behind the flag, behind the person in the White House when the United States or any country is in a state of war. So certainly that could have something to do with it. But we do have to recognize that Donald Trump has been on this warpath with Iran since the time he got into office and he tore up the Iran nuclear deal, which was a deal that was agreed upon back under Obama's days in 2015 and was approved by the United Nations, by the entire European Union, by the Chinese and the Russians, and that Iran was abiding by the agreement. So Donald Trump tearing that agreement up, imposing these very, very onerous sanctions on Iran, was really already starting a path of economic warfare that could very well lead to a full-blown war.
Do you think there could be a possibility to be a full-blown war?
I'm very, very nervous about it. I've been in a state of just internal turmoil since the killing of Soleimani, thinking, oh my God, this is going to lead to a full-blown war, because how can Iran has to respond. They have to. You've seen millions of people out on the streets with the funeral procession. I mean, so many people, there's been stampedes in which people have died. You see genuine desire among Iranian people to say to their government, you better do something about it, you better respond. And then there are Iran's allies in other parts of the world, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, like Shia that live in other parts of the world that are saying the same thing. We want to see a adequate response to this. So how is this not going to end up in a full-blown war?
And he was saying that it was pathetic that President Obama was trying to initiate a war against Iran for re-election purposes. Is he doing exactly the same thing?
He could be very well doing the exact same thing, in which the whole country of the United States will be held hostage by Donald Trump because he has initiated a war thinking that would be good for his re-election.
You have been following very closely this region, the Middle East. And we have seen that in 1953, for example, there was a coup d'etat, that in that case, the British were asking the help of the CIA, of the US, in order to take the coup d'etat. Before, almost at the beginning of the century, 1908 to 1953, the Brits were taking close to 90% of the profits of the oil. Then came the Shah, and it was a fantastic relationship. There were three American presidents talking about Eisenhower, Nixon, and Jimmy Carter says, Iran is beautiful, fantastic, our friendship is unequal, because we were exploiting their oil. Then in 1979, there is Khomeini. And they recovered their sovereignty and became the enemy. So bottom line, what is really behind all this in the Middle East is a control of the oil?
It's control of the oil, it's access that U.S. and British and other companies want to the resources of the Middle East. People have to recognize that when the U.S., the CIA orchestrated the coup in 1953, it was precisely because the government in power at that time, democratically elected, wanted to nationalize the oil. The U.S. would have never gone into Iraq were it not for the oil. And so because in some ways this region is cursed by the riches of oil that runs the global economy, the U.S. has wanted to have governments in power that are friendly to U.S. economic interests.
Do you see the same pattern in Latin America?
Absolutely. Why is the U.S. so focused on Venezuela and trying to overthrow the government of Maduro there? Because it has this huge reserves of oil. Unfortunately, the U.S., even though we produce more and more of our own oil, the U.S. government and the U.S. Large economic interests want to have control over the rest of the world's access to that oil.
Going back to what you were mentioning, more than 80 cities with demonstrations, massive demonstrations. It's going to be a new world demonstration on January the 25th, organizing that. Why the mass media in the US is not showing that and is not questioning what the US is doing really in the region?
The large media in the United States is controlled by corporations, and they're the part of the same universe of transnationals, of corporations that believe that the U.S. is an exceptional country, that the U.S. has the right to determine who rules in the rest of the world, that the U.S. has the right to have over 800 military bases around the world. And that's why it's so important that we, as a global community, rise up against this and say that, no, the United States does not have the right to intervene in other countries, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba or Iran or anywhere, and that we, the global community, will try to restrict the ability of the United States to try to impose its will on other countries.
How much the war machine is key for the economy of the U.S.?
The U.S., the manufacturing base of the United States, has really been gutted with globalization in the last couple of decades. But there's one sector that's really thriving, and that is the military sector. And we see that whenever there are talks about peace, their stocks go down. And when there's possibilities of new wars, like right now, their stocks go up. So we also see this tremendous connection between the people in power, not just who's in the Pentagon and their relationships to the military, the weapons makers, because they rotate in and out, but it's also who are the advisors in the White House and who's in Congress. We have more and more people these days that are part of that military industrial complex. And then we see all the money that those weapon makers give in the political campaigns. So it's this very insidious relationship between those who make the weapons and profit from the wars and those who make the decisions about taking us to war.
In the case of the media, we were seeing that they're portraying the Middle East as a region that is unstable. Like there's a problem of the Arabs, if you want.
They always kill each other, right? They're always fighting.
They're not really dependable countries or people. How much the U.S. is contributing to that instability?
Well, in the last few decades, I think we can say it is the U.S. that has been the #1 destroyer of stability. You might not have liked Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but you know what? That's none of our business. The U.S. went in, overthrew that government, and ironically, that was a Sunni government put in a Shia government, which is now closer to Iran. And then the U.S. complains about their relationship with Iran. The same thing in Afghanistan. The Taliban were enemies of Iran, but the U.S. went in there, overthrew that, created tremendous instability that exists today. When the Taliban was in, not that I like them, but there wasn't the same opium production as there is now with the United States that affects the entire world. The U.S. has created the sectarian divisions that were under control to a large extent in the Middle East, and has pitted Sunni against Sunni, Shia against Shia, Sunni against Shia, Kurds against the Sunnis, and this has now opened the way for extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, extremist groups like ISIS. So the U.S. is responsible for so much of the instability in the Middle East right now.
How vulnerable is Israel after this attack? Is more or less?
Well, Israel is way more vulnerable, but it's interesting because it's the very Israeli government that has been pushing the United States to go to war with Iran. They never wanted the U.S. to be signing an Iran nuclear deal. They were always saying that the U.S. should go in militarily and take out Iran's facilities, even though Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but Israel has many nuclear weapons. So Israel has been goading the United States on in this, but Israel is becoming more and more vulnerable as every day goes by.
And what about Saudi Arabia, that the U.S. is trying to consider one of the largest partners in the region and has a reputation of violating human rights left and right? And also, in the 9/11 attacks, most of the attackers were from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it's ridiculous now how our government is trying to pin 9/11 on Iran that had nothing to do with 9/11, and yet where the hijackers came from is Saudi Arabia, and that's the closest U.S. ally, so it doesn't make any sense. I think Saudi Arabia recognizes how vulnerable it is now, because it could very well have been the Iranians who attacked the oil fields and the refinery that cut out 50% of Saudi Arabia's production for about a month. And so there are rumors that Saudi Arabia and Iran had been talking to each other through Iraq, and that was the very reason why Soleimani was in Iraq, to deliver a response from the Iranian government. But in any case, it does seem like the Saudis are very worried because they too are in the crosshairs.
Do you believe there are going to be retaliations here in the U.S. or to U.S. objectives or military bases?
You know, I'm surprised to hear Iranians say that they're going to focus on military bases. I think it makes much more sense in terms of military to military, but I would think that Iran would want the American people to be afraid as well, and not think that this is just going to happen somewhere else in the Middle East. And if the Iranians don't do it, could be somebody else who's a part of the Shia large community around the world who wants to attack people in the United States in response. So who knows? I don't think anybody in this country or any Americans living overseas should feel comfortable right now.
There are some analysts that are saying, so far it looks like Trump has shooting himself on the foot. Why? Because if the parliament of Iraq is asking to the troops of the U.S. to remove, the Shias are going to take control. There are the same Shias that control Iran, so they lose influence in the region. On the other hand, the possibility of the presence of the U.S. is weakened. So basically he's creating exactly the opposite effect that he's trying to sell it to the American public.
Absolutely. You know, in the last couple of months, there have been huge demonstrations in Iraq that the U.S. government, particularly Mike Pompeo, have said, go, great, you know, we want you out on the streets. And they wanted to move those protests to be focused against the Iranian influence. Well, look at today. Now the people out in the streets in Iraq are people who are out against the U.S. influence and showing their sympathy for the Iranians and particularly for Soleimani. And we're not going to see anti-Iran demonstrations in Iraq. That's gone for now. And then the same is true in Iran. There were demonstrations recently in Iran, and the U.S. was saying, yes, get out on the street. Those were demonstrations against the Iranian government. Those are gone now. It has unified the Iranian people behind their own government. Even if they didn't like the government a week ago, Today, they are behind the government. So absolutely the opposite of what Donald Trump would want.
Your forecast, Donald Trump is going to be reelected?
I have no idea. Before this happened, I was worried that he might be reelected. I am still worried because of this idea of rallying around the president in a